March 14, 2012, my son Thomas lost his battle with the disease of addiction. I now belong to a club that no parent should ever belong to. Do you know the signs? Do you know the trends that children are doing in today's world? Do you know the signs and symptoms? Do you know the signs and symptoms of drug abuse? I want to empower and educate Long Islanders by bringing a force of professionals and how to prevent the disease of addiction. Long Island in crisis. Good evening. My name is Linda Ventura, and welcome to Long Island in Crisis. We as a nation have an opiate and heroin epidemic with Long Island as the epicenter. I am the founder of Thomas's Hope, and unfortunately I am because on March 14, 2012, I lost my 21-year-old son Thomas to the disease of addiction, specifically a heroin overdose. We as a family watched this vibrant, bright young man become broken and bound by an insidious disease that left a host to do whatever it wanted with Thomas. I don't miss Thomas the addict any second of any one day, but I miss my son every second of every day. He was kidnapped by a drug and a disease that he had no control over. And the purpose of this show, I hope, will be to empower and educate Long Islanders on the disease. It is not a moral failing. It is not a failing of parenting. It's nobody's fault. It can strike anyone, any day, of any gender, of any background, rich, poor. It does not discriminate. So we'd like to empower, and just so that parents are aware of what could be going on in their schools, in their own homes. The dues for the club that I belong to now is way too high. No parent should ever belong to this club. It rips your heart and soul out. So this Sunday, when we celebrate Mother's Day, I will celebrate with my other two children, but we always have that one missing piece. And that is unacceptable in today's world. My guest tonight is Dr. Jeffrey Reynolds, and the other night during a presentation, he mentioned that if a school district sent out an email or a letter that a big black van with darkened windows was driving up and down the streets of your school district, kidnapping children, the community would be up in arms, and people would be racing down to find out, what are the police going to do? What is the school going to do? What as a community are we going to do? That van is here, and that van is called the disease of addiction. It includes alcohol, cigarettes, marijuana. Kids don't wake up one day and decide to be a heroin addict. My 15-year-old son didn't wake up one day and say, I think I'm going to destroy my family, rip out my mother's heart, and become a heroin addict. That did not happen. It's a fatal progressive disease. We've had barriers to treatment, and we're going to discuss all of those things. And now I'd like to introduce my guest, Dr. Jeffrey Reynolds, who, by the way, was the recipient of the Long Island Council on Alcohol and Drug Dependency Leadership Award last night. Very proud of you, as always.
Thanks, I appreciate it. And thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to a great conversation.
Absolutely. So talk to me, Jeff. Tell our audience about the trends that are going on in today's world.
You know, for years, people have been asking me, is it getting any better? Is it getting any better? And the heroin crisis and the opiate crisis on Long Island actually isn't all that new. 15, 20 years ago, the New York Times was writing stories about Long Island and how heroin had come to suburbia. And each year since then, it's gotten progressively worse over time. We haven't yet turned a corner. We know it's getting worse because the overdose fatalities continue to climb, the treatment admissions continue to climb, arrests, for both drug and non-drug related crimes continue to climb. And as you said, there are more and more parents who wind up being a part of a club that nobody wants to be a part of. And so, we have a long way to go. I think, we've seen some movement in the right direction. I think, some of that movement relates to legislation, but also in the midst of a crisis, I think job number one has been to keep people alive. And so there have been changes in the law when it comes to lessening or eliminating the criminal penalties if someone's experiencing an overdose and you call for help. We have seen the widespread distribution of Narcan, for example, which up until 5 years ago was relatively unheard of. I think we have advanced the conversation around access to prescription medications. As you know, we took on both the medical society and the insurance industry, and we won in a very, very big way. So it's not to say that we haven't made some gains, but we haven't yet turned the corner. I will say, though, and maybe this is a little bit optimistic, I feel like we're just on the cusp of turning that corner.
I feel that way, too, because we have so much more attention, media, families getting involved. The stigma of addiction is unacceptable. It's not a parent's fault.
Right.
It's not the failing of the patient that's dealing with the disease. And people need to acknowledge that. People need to be both the person struggling with the disease and the family that supports them. Because I know way too many parents that could be standing next to each other on the soccer field, each struggling with the same thing, but nobody's willing to talk about it.
This disease thrives on that kind of secrecy.
Yeah.
And I can remember, 20 years ago I worked in HIV, mostly with injection drug users in North Bellport. And the same stigma that exists today drove everything back then. And the fact that nobody talks about substance use, and when we do, it's in hushed tones, it's all about being a moral failing. I think we know more about the human brain now than ever before, which should give us some insights into the disease as a concept, how it progresses and everything else. And that should translate into public opinion. So far, that hasn't translated. What has translated, and I give you and the other moms, quite frankly, credit for this, is putting a human face on this has gone a long way. We know the science, but people don't internalize the science. I think when you speak or Terry or anybody else comes out and tells their story, it's something that everyone can relate to. And I think it's only then that people begin to say, there but for the grace of God go I, and really understand this. I can remember, my mom died of chronic alcoholism 20 years ago, and there was a big debate with my brother and I as to whether or not, and she died of the disease, not something else. And I remember there was a big debate in my family about whether or not we talked about that as part of the eulogy and acknowledged that that was the case. And at least a couple family members said, well, nobody really knows about it. And I said, oh, no, they all know. Her coworkers knew, everybody kind of knew, and I did the eulogy and, of course, made it a topic of conversation. And everyone was shaking their heads yes, and everybody knew it. I would say to this day, families still have that internal struggle or even a public debate about how much do we talk about, how much do we disclose. But each time we tell the story, we make it more okay, we make it more acceptable, and we make it more routine. And quite frankly, I think we build a bridge to other people.
We have to build the bridge. Like I said, we grew up, I live in Kings Park on the North Shore. Thomas had a very normal childhood. We had trauma in our lives. We lost all 3 grandparents, and we got divorced in the midst of that. And he was a sweet, sensitive kid that couldn't deal with a lot of pain. And I remember having the conversation with him, and he'd say, it's only pot.
Right.
But did I know that he didn't have the shut-off valve in his brain? Right. And that's what people need to, that they fail to recognize. Out of your children, do you know which child is going to have a problem moving forward?
That's right.
Every heroin addict, and our friend Anthony Rizzuto always says this, everyone doesn't start out, everyone who has the disease of addiction won't become addicted to heroin from starting with the gateway drugs, cigarettes, alcohol, marijuana. But every heroin addict started with cigarettes, alcohol, and marijuana. So kids today, when I hear parents, I cringe when they tell me that. Oh, well, thank God my kid only smokes, pot and drinks beer, and they're going to football parties. They're still 12. They're still 14.
Absolutely.
It's unacceptable. Yeah. I don't know about you, but I know that when I came home from the hospital, I came home with my mother holding me in the front seat. We know now that
Of
car
course,
seats save lives.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
if we know better, we should do better. They didn't raise the drinking age to 21 because they thought it was, good
Right.
for business.
Right.
They raised it because of the knowledge that we have today.
And the public health consequences. We now know that if you consume alcohol before the age of 15, you're 5 times more likely to develop an addiction over the course of your lifetime. And maybe it doesn't happen spontaneously. Maybe it lurks in the shadows until you go through a midlife crisis, or you lose a job or a divorce, or something else happens, or you're having a great life and you begin drinking too much.
Mm-hmm.
The current debate about marijuana drives me nuts in some regards because, well, I don't think anybody should be locked up for low-level drug offenses. And quite frankly, our jails and prisons are full predominantly of men of color who have been arrested on low-level drug offenses. When we have a national debate and suggest that perhaps marijuana isn't dangerous, and we begin comparing it to other substances, and determining relative risk is pretty difficult. It depends on a whole bunch of things, including your body chemistry, circumstances, and everything else, without
Age.
telling the other side.
Right.
I think we're headed down a difficult road, and if you look at the history with tobacco, and tobacco was put out there as having medicinal properties early on.
Mm-hmm.
A huge industry developed overnight, and people made trillions of dollars on it.
Yes, they
And I
did.
see some of the same patterns here without saying, look, for some people to smoke marijuana recreationally, it might work out okay for them. But for the vast majority of young people in particular, it's not going to work out okay. And since when is inhaling unfiltered smoke a good idea? Or medicine,
Right,
quite frankly.
or medicine.
Right.
But children today are using the vape pens,
Right,
and they're
Right.
creating that wax
right.
that's 90% THC.
Yeah.
That in an adolescent brain is not going to add up
Changes
to
your
good.
brain chemistry, right?
Right.
We know that the brain is undergoing significant development at that point in time, just like you tell your kids don't sniff magic markers, right?
Right.
It's the same kind of thing. You don't want to introduce intoxicants into that brain development process. And it's ironic at a time when we're trying to wrestle with educational policy to help our kids get ahead, we're losing ground in other regards. At the same time, we're trying to become more competitive as an economy, as in a country. We're willing to give back some of the public health gains we've gotten around tobacco use, around drunk driving. And my concern is we give all that back with the current debate about marijuana.
We talk about drunk driving, though, but how about talking about kids driving
Right.
while they're high on marijuana?
Right. The average kid will tell you, and really smart kids, quite frankly, will tell you, I think I drive better when I'm under the influence of marijuana because I'm calmer, I'm more chill, I have less impulse, I have fewer impulses. And it's
I
like
can't
what we
even
heard about
fathom that.
alcohol decades
Yeah.
ago. And really, I sat with the kids, I don't know, a couple of years ago in the Jericho School District. So the cream of the crop, academically, smarter kids who should know better. And one kid said it, and I looked horrified, and I said, do you all think that? And they said, oh, yeah. It wasn't an anomaly. And so, that goes back to, the old school times when we had to educate them about drunk
Yeah.
driving. It's almost like we have to start over again now.
When I speak to some parents and their children do have a problem with addiction, and I say, I'll listen to the story and the progression of what they're telling me, and I'll ask them, are they still driving? Oh, yes. Well, we had to take him off our insurance because he had 4 or 5 accidents, and, we put him on his own policy, and it's costing us a fortune. So
Right.
I pause and I say, let's think about that. And it takes them a few minutes to really figure out they're driving under the influence, and that's what, are you okay as a parent if they kill a family of 4 driving home
Right.
one night?
It's hard, I think, for parents, and you could probably relate to this. It's very hard, well, it's easy, rather, not to put the pieces together,
Yes.
right? Because there's things we worry about with our kids more than anything else, motor vehicles being one of them. And I think particularly if you have a young person who's walking down the road of addiction, this happens in stages. It doesn't happen overnight. And so there's a quiet progression that marches on and marches on. And I think as parents, yes, we have a gut instinct, but it's also easy to dismiss some of the signs and symptoms we might see and say, well, it's a phase. For most kids, this happens in adolescence. Adolescence means a whole bunch of crazy behavior,
Absolutely.
right? Really hard to sort out.
Absolutely.
So what's an active addiction or the beginnings of addiction, and what's just teenage craziness?
Right.
Easily confused.
As a parent, though, and you have 2 little ones, You always know when there's something wrong.
Sure.
So, when you think there's something wrong, you have to investigate. You have to open the door. You have to, don't be afraid to drug test your kids. Be a parent. Don't be their friend. They may get aggravated with you. They may get upset. They're going to get upset anyway.
Right.
Doesn't really, what does that have to do with, being a parent?
Right.
My parents certainly didn't have any problem telling me.
And there was no right to privacy in your parents' home.
No,
As long as they were paying the mortgage, there was no privacy.
That's right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
I think it's gotten, technology has made it tougher for parents because now there's social media, there's instant cell communication, which means the kids hook up for parties a lot faster. Other kids are able to solicit them a lot easier. And so if you follow kind of the chain of what's happening, there's more independent time for young people. Parents frequently are working 2 and 3 jobs in order to make ends meet. There are more drugs available. Just there's a wider menu than there ever was before. I think the availability is greater than ever before. I think our kids in some ways have more pressures than they used to have, particularly around academics. There's fewer services out there for kids, and so you take all that and you shake it up, and you have a really difficult scenario for young people growing up today. But I think technology's made it harder. Bullying
is a huge problem, and now you can cyberbully, and no one is held accountable for that.
Right.
But our children, why is it that they don't feel that they fit in? Why are they having such a hard time coping in today's world? A lot of what I see or what I feel is the top 3 teams should get a trophy. Not everyone gets a trophy.
Right.
There's going to be disappointments in your kids' lives.
Right.
You have to let them experience it. You also have to let them experience the consequences of the decisions that they do make.
Right.
And if that means that they're in trouble at school, then that means that they're in trouble at school. And but too many parents are adversarial, I feel, with the school district. And the school districts that I work with, they want to be on your side. And when they call you to tell you that they're seeing changes in your child, they're not doing it to single your child out. They're doing it to, help you. And, they all want a good result for your child.
I can remember probably 2 years ago, I had a call from a parent in a fairly well-off school district on Long Island, and she said, my son got caught with pills in school, and they're throwing him out. Can you help me get a lawyer? I can't help you get a lawyer, but I can help you find treatment for your kid. Take the $10,000 you would spend on a lawyer and buy treatment for your child, because that's what's needed here. But there, too, you have parents that, look, they become part of the process in a lot of cases.
Yes.
And so this has been a gradual kind of process. Everyone has begun to make accommodations for that process and scramble to do something. I think part of that relates to the parental guilt.
Yes.
And that you always look, anytime anything goes wrong with your kids, you look and say, well, what did I do wrong? Could I have done it? You always second guess.
Absolutely.
And so those feelings conspire with the addiction to say, all right, let's all find a way out of this. It might not be the healthiest or most productive way out of it, but everybody looks for a graceful way to deal with this. And sometimes there's not. Sometimes it is what it is.
That's the time you have to put on your big girl and big boy panties and go to bat. And really, there's no easy way out of it. And let's talk about family. So the disease looks to isolate and, keep everyone hidden and let it grow and make you feel isolated and alone. So family is so important that when the patient goes for treatment, that the family go for treatment.
Absolutely.
I know in my own family that my other 2 children had voices that would go unheard. They were angry. They were angry that Thomas got attention for bad behavior. But I fortunately recognized that, and I showed up for wrestling tournaments, and I had to be a mom to Jennifer and Andrew because they deserved a mom. And they deserved a house that was, not compromised with the craziness of one. Yeah. And that is not an easy place to be. And it breaks your heart.
That's true. I think you see a lot of kids who begin using in order to get that attention. Right? If they don't get that attention, they'll say, well, this is what he's doing in order to get the attention. If I want the same level of attention, then I ought to do exactly what he's doing. And then you have, for kids that lose their battle, siblings go through a whole grief process. And sometimes that grief process frequently includes a lot of anger.
Tremendous
look at
anger.
what you put us through.
Yes.
And, I guess for some kids, you can shut that down. It's going to come out sooner rather than later. But you were very proactive in making sure that everybody had what they needed. But very often families just want to put an end to that and say, it's a chapter that's done. I've moved on.
Right.
It's hard to move on unless you do the work.
You have to do the work. There's no easy, I can even share, my youngest son found his brother, and he was a senior in high school when he found Thomas in the bathroom. That is, I can't even imagine what he sees every day in his head.
Right.
I really can't imagine that. And I feel, if I feel guilt about that, why wasn't I home? But that wasn't the way that it was meant to be.
Right.
And thankfully, he's a strong individual. And just this year, when he turned 21, he had a bad day on his birthday because he was really angry that his brother wasn't there to celebrate it with him and to be in his life. And since that day, I've seen a huge change because he let an awful lot of anger out that day.
Right.
But that was his proof. You can make treatment available for, for him, but he has to go and he has to do the work too.
Right. Well, and very often they'll feel like, why do I have to go do this?
Right.
This was your thing. Right?
Exactly. But it leaves no stone unturned, and there are an awful lot of collateral damage in this disease. An awful lot of collateral damage.
And there's an anger that you don't see with other diseases. Right? So
Yes.
if Thomas had something else in which he was a victim of, right? We look at it differently. So the culpability that we think plays into the equation here fuels a lot of the anger and some of the behaviors. Right in your intro, you talked about how you didn't cherish your time with Thomas the addict, but Thomas the son was a whole different ballgame.
Yeah.
And so you found a way to separate the disease from the person. And I think that's a real victory if you can do it. And a lot of folks work unsuccessfully to get there.
The difference, the stark difference between those two people. Heroin was Thomas's best friend and his boss. And it drove him to do things that he would never do if he was sober, including stealing, selling all jewelry. I can even remember a month after he died, I had bought a new lawnmower the fall before, and when we went out to get it, it was gone. And I thought, oh my God, what desperation. I could feel his pain.
Sure.
Andrew, on the other hand, he was quite angry.
Right.
And that led to, but everybody grieves differently. Everybody has to walk through that process, and there's no easy way out.
Right.
But if you don't sit through the grief or the anger or all of those things, it will come back out, and it doesn't leave you. It'll leave you in a worse place. So that's why, Jeff and I are on the board of directors for Families in Supportive Treatment. Yeah. And that's so important for the families to have a voice, for the families to get treatment, and, to feel okay that you're not in this all alone.
I think, the other theme that I think came up early in our conversation was the importance of acting on your gut and acting early. This is one of those things that it doesn't go away. It will not get better on its own. It's going to get progressively worse. It's like most other medical conditions. Yeah, you get some things that might disappear, but for the most part, any serious disease you get is going to get progressively worse over time. And so with this kind of thing, the sooner you intervene, the better off you are. I always say to parents, if you begin feeling like something's going on, start keeping a log, because sometimes it's hard to put all the pieces together. When you read it in black and white, came home, I thought I smelled alcohol, grades are sliding, overheard a weird conversation on the phone, was there a significant change in friends, noticed he had $200 yesterday and doesn't have anything today. And so I always say to parents, if you think something's going on, start keeping notes just for yourself. Put it into your phone,
Absolutely.
Write it down on a piece of paper, and at some point take it out and look at it. And if you begin to see a few things happening, there's a basis to have a conversation, and that conversation doesn't have to be confrontative. It should be urgent, right? But it doesn't have to be confrontative. You want to keep the door open for future communication, but parents will always say, but I don't even know how to start the conversation.
Yeah, that's
I'm concerned about you. I noticed
Yes.
the following things. Is everything okay? And odds are you're going to get a yes, everything's fine. Why? They're going to storm out. That's what kids do. But the more you raise it, so often I will hear not only kids but adults say, I was in the worst place in my life and nobody said anything. And so I felt bad, but I didn't think anybody noticed. And so I didn't think it was that bad. If it was that bad, why didn't anybody say anything to me?
Wow.
And so we tiptoe around and say, well, maybe this or maybe that, or I don't want to upset them, or I'm going to make it worse, or whatever else. But in some cases, that person's looking for someone from the outside to say, what is going on? And when we don't, we almost allow it to continue.
Yeah. Well, you validate that they seem to be okay.
Right.
That's why don't be afraid to open the door. Do you encourage parents to drug test their kids if they...
I think it can be really useful. There are some folks that say, well, that's an invasion of privacy. My theory on that is if you need to drug test your kid, it's going to come back positive, right? Because you're really not going to push this unless you suspect something's going on. And generally, if you suspect something's going on, it's going on.
Yeah.
And so I always say to parents, look, if you need that in order to embolden yourself or to say, here is the concrete proof, and I know you're lying to me, then by all means use it. It shouldn't be the be-all and end-all, but it can be a tool to say, now I know you have a problem. I suspected it, and I knew 99.9%. There's the other 0.1% I needed. Also, look, for kids that are struggling, knowing you're being tested can be a really effective tool.
Yeah.
And I've had kids who have said, look, I would have used, but I knew I was being tested, and I knew there'd be consequences. And so I think it's a really important test. It shouldn't, though, replace just good parenting and vigilance. You shouldn't say, well, I'll do the test once a month, and otherwise I'm home free.
Right.
There's ways around the test. Kids can get involved in all sorts of other things.
Yeah.
It's really you want to take, as we do as parents, is take every resource available to you, every sense, every bit of wisdom you have, every tool you have, and bring that to bear for the safety and well-being of your kids. So if it's a tool that works for you, then by all means use it.
You know, and when I always go back to my parents. My parents raised 5 kids. So if I said I was going to a party and my mother was going to call the other house, I better make sure that I was going to be at that party or
That's right.
not lie.
Right.
So do you encourage parents to follow up on what's being said?
You know, this is one of those things where it's all hands on deck. You know more than anyone. In some cases, these are life or death decisions. Yeah. And so my attitude is, you do anything within your power and anything within your means. You know, God knows if our toddlers were running into the street, we would do anything to body block them and pull them back from being hit.
Absolutely.
This is really no different. You know, look, I have young kids, and I'm surprised at how many parents will drop their kids off at my house having not met me.
We are just going to be wrapping up, and please stay tuned for part 2. This is Long Island in Crisis. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Hotel room, musty peeling pale, time to pull back those shades.
March 14th, 2012, my son Thomas lost his battle with the disease of addiction. I now belong to a club that no parent should ever belong to. Do you know the signs? Do you know the trends that children are doing in today's world? Do you know the signs and symptoms? Do you know the signs and symptoms of drug abuse? I want to empower and educate Long Islanders by bringing a force of professionals and how to prevent the disease of addiction. Long Island in Crisis. Good evening. My name is Linda Ventura, and this is part 2 of my interview with Dr. Jeff Reynolds. This is Long Island in Crisis. So Jeff, last year we got an awful lot done up in Albany for access to treatment. And I know that there are parents that have heard this story before. I mean, I know for myself, I was told Thomas is not high enough for treatment, and he needs to fail at outpatient. Well, he failed at outpatient with the worst possible consequences. So let's talk about some treatment options.
You know, one of the things we know about addiction is that it's a treatable disease. If you intervene in a timely way, if you give folks the right kind of treatment, if you promote recovery, then there's a much better chance of having a victory here. Yet treatment has not become more available on Long Island. It's actually become a little less available. But one of the key barriers to that was insurance companies. And insurance companies who for decades collected premiums from families across Long Island, and collecting those premiums made a whole bunch of money, and then families wind up with a loved one with a problem and say, well, look, I need treatment, this is what's going on. And the insurance companies have very different policies for diseases below the neck than they do for diseases above the neck. And so when it comes to mental health coverage and coverage for substance abuse disorders, they have a whole series of policies, and some of them will disappear, hopefully pretty quickly, that are discriminatory. But because families don't know any better, because sometimes they're mired in the secrecy, they don't know to fight. And in some cases, when an insurance company says, look, they're not sick enough for inpatient treatment, it's a relief to families who will say, maybe
good.
I'm turning this into a bigger thing. It's not so serious. It's kind of like when any of us go to the emergency room and they don't keep us, we're like, so it wasn't such a big deal.
Right.
Or you go to the doctor and you don't get a prescription. You're like, how sick was I? This is the same kind of thing. So you have an insurance company saying, no, in our opinion, they just go see a counselor once a week and everything's going to be okay. And we know that it doesn't work that way. And they were doing that regardless of the prescription that a healthcare provider might get. So when you talk with someone about their substance abuse problem, there's a bunch of things that you're looking at: their duration of use, their drug of choice, how often they're using, whether or not they've had disruption in key life areas. And you're doing a complete assessment to say, okay, I have an accurate picture now, here's what I'm recommending. The insurance companies would say, I don't care what the healthcare professional recommends, we're only paying for X, Y, and Z, which left families in a really, really difficult position, and in a lot of cases not getting the care that they deserved. For the patients, they were more than happy to say, see, I told you I didn't need to go. Right?
Exactly.
You spend 6 months getting them to the door of a treatment facility. Insurance company says no, and they're like, see, I told you, I'm not doing this.
And that window for the person, the family always sees what's going on.
Right.
Just like with your mom.
Right.
Everyone else sees that there's a problem.
Absolutely.
But the person struggling with the disease thinks that they're so smart.
That's the calling card of addiction.
Yes.
That's the only disease that tells you, you don't have it, you don't have it.
You don't have it.
Don't worry,
you're
everything's fine.
Nobody's noticing that you're high as a kite. It's okay. So, it's a problem. So for me, especially with the children, our children, earlier intervention, appropriate level of care is a game changer.
Absolutely. And now, one of the other, and we worked on the bill, we got it done over the objections of the insurance industry. It was, quite frankly, and I say this all the time, it was the moms that got this bill done. There's no other explanation for this, because in the history of the state legislature, virtually there's no lobby that's as powerful as the insurance industry, and they put tons of money into fighting us, and lobbyists and everything else, and we all came out on top largely because of people like you. So what the law says now is it says the insurance companies can't do those kind of things, that they have to use objective criteria in determining if someone should be in an outpatient setting or, quote unquote, go into a facility for a period of 30 days or more.
They also have to tell you what the criteria is.
Right. There's more transparency now.
Yes, and there needs to be.
And one of the difficulties, though, is that even in a best case scenario, we're talking about, in a lot of cases, 30 days worth of treatment. And so the typical trajectory of this is you've got someone who begins using other drugs, alcohol, marijuana. They begin experimenting with pills. Pills turns into more pills, turns into heroin. And it's usually some life-changing event, an arrest, they lose a job, something else happens that gets them into treatment. But from inception to use to that treatment entry could be 2 or 3 years. The time is shorter now than it used to be with a drug like alcohol that took 30 years for you to suffer consequences. But it's still 2 or 3 years, and so we believe it took you 2 or 3 years to walk into the woods. Walking you out in 30 days is not likely, because if you're young, your brain chemistry has changed. If you're not young, your behaviors have changed. Your life has changed. Over the course of 2 or 3 years, you've changed as a person. You've experienced things that are really hard to unwind, that you can, but it takes time to do it. And so You
There
know,
also may be underlying, an underlying mental health disorder.
oh, look, if a parent calls me and says, they've had 3 relapses, they've been in 10 facilities, I know from a mile away what's driving that.
Right.
Here in Nassau and Suffolk, there are fewer mental health resources than ever before. I know of a half dozen mental health clinics that have closed in the past 3 years.
Yeah.
Quite frankly, you can't keep them open financially. And so when folks have untreated mental health issues, we know they wind up somewhere. They wind up in jail having committed crimes. They wind up in homeless shelters. They wind up in hospitals, or they wind up in substance abuse treatment facilities, in which you spend 30 days saying, why are you using drugs? What's going on? Let's try to get you not to use drugs. But if you come out on day 31 and that anxiety is coming back, or depression, or whatever drove it in the first place hasn't been addressed, you can white knuckle it for a long time, but eventually you're going to really struggle. And so, all the facilities talk now about co-occurring disorders and dealing with both things simultaneously.
But you need time to diagnose all of that.
It takes time.
It takes time. It takes time for the patient to open up and to share all of those experiences, to gain your trust.
Right.
Trust
particularly if there's
for
trauma.
them. Yeah.
Right. So with a lot of young women, there's trauma somewhere along the line, and that might take 6 months, a year to even come out.
To unwind,
Right.
they need to feel safe before they're even going to share that. Families, what do you like to recommend? I mean, families, I know for me, I had a support system. I had family and I had friends that I leaned on.
Yeah.
I always said to anybody, and I'll say it right now, I don't really care what a person who I don't know thinks about me.
Right.
Because it doesn't affect my life in any way.
Right.
If you know me, you know what I stand for, who I am as a person, how my children were raised, and anybody that wants to criticize me, go right ahead.
Right.
I'll switch places with you if you want to accept everything that I've been through.
Right.
That's me, but there are a lot of people that struggle
Yep.
with what others think of them.
Yeah, and sooner or later you let go of that. I think the best advice is don't try to do this by yourself, regardless of what point you are in this process. Doing it by yourself is really, really tricky. Lots of people try to do this, quite frankly, until they can't anymore. A number of family support groups have popped up in recent years. Some really good ones, in fact. Families Anonymous has expanded in a pretty dramatic way. There are other self-help groups that are very, very helpful to folks. And so there are, I'd say, although I feel like treatment is still elusive for a lot of folks, and it should be where if you've identified a problem and you want to go into treatment, you pick up the phone or you drive to a facility and boom, you're in. For families, we've got to make that kind of support as accessible.
We do.
I mean, a lot has popped up, and there's, while there are organized groups that do this, there are as many unorganized groups, just families that have come together that have found a common bond and a common sense of sharing and a common experience and all of this. And, for me, when we look at the history of this crisis and say, how did we get through it? What good came out of it? Families connecting in the way they have and turning grief into change, into power, into mutual support and unconditional love. That's the home run.
That's the home run. I know, sitting with the other moms that you're speaking about, and we don't have to talk because we all know how we feel, and that it's okay to laugh and it's okay to smile because life is still good. We all miss that person, but we're allowed to smile, and to smile in a group with each of us knowing, and we can cry at the drop of a hat too, but to have that comfort level to do that with others. And even when I speak to people that are struggling with the disease now, I've walked in your shoes there too.
Right.
So I know the insanity that you're going through, and it's okay for you to be angry. It's okay for you to put your foot down. It's okay to put, whatever consequences you need to put on your loved one to get you through this crisis. You're entitled to come home to your house and be okay in your house.
Yeah.
You need to feel, that's your safe zone. And whatever you have to do to get your house safe, you do.
Yeah. And I think, parents bouncing these strategies, because there's no right or wrong answers in dealing with this. Parents will say, we'll have a conversation about the police come, do I press charges, do I bail them out, that kind of thing. And, I have some ideas about it, but I'll always say this is an imprecise science. I can give you some experience, and I've seen kind of the macro view of a lot of folks, but nothing that, nothing that's going to say I can give you the best advice
Right.
in the world. I can tell you what I've seen and kind of what my gut says and the experiences of other folks, but at the end of it, it's
You have
your
to be
decision.
comfortable
Right.
with your decision. You
Right.
have to be able to look yourself in the eye
Right.
at the end of the day, look in the mirror and say, I did everything I could,
Right.
and I'm okay with what I did today.
That's right.
And tomorrow's another day.
It's not easy. I watch parents struggle all the time with some of these questions. Do I put them out of the house? What I do try to do is break through some of the fallacies, because parents will say, if I put them out of the house, then I have no control whatsoever. And on that, I will say, you have no control anyway.
Yes.
This is an illusion. It doesn't exist. You don't have it. So that shouldn't be the basis on which you make a decision. You can say, I don't want to put them out of the house because they'll engage in behaviors that are even more dangerous. Legitimate, worth a conversation. I think to the extent that we can break down some of those fallacies, kind of clear out some of the emotional stuff and bring some clarity to the situation, that's the most you can hope for.
Unfortunately, parents also think that if they put them out of the house, they're going to die out of the house. And that is a big fallacy, because most overdoses occur in the home.
Yeah. And look, I think parents supporting parents goes a long way too. I think, having letters after your name doesn't necessarily make you an expert in everyone's life. And some of this is, I find when parents reach out to others and speak to a variety of people. I mean, people have figured this out now that, you don't talk to one person, you talk to two or three, if only because you're looking for an answer that you want. But in some cases, because you're getting more input. And I'd say, in terms of kind of what's come out of this, there are people who are connected, including you and I, who never would have necessarily connected. There are friendships that will last a lifetime. And the common bond is a concern about our community and a concern about our kids.
Absolutely. Let's talk about Narcan.
Yeah.
So, great drug, reversing overdoses. However, I have a big concern with the however. If it's not followed by treatment, what have we done? Because I'll be the first one to say, if Thomas was going to live a life that included not getting treatment for his addiction and him having to endure that life, because that's a painful existence.
Yeah.
The withdrawal, the need to use again, all of that. I'm okay with what happened if treatment was not going to be available for him.
Right.
So how do we control that?
I'm a big proponent of Narcan. It's a cheap drug, should be available over the counter. It's a life-saving thing. I liken it to an EpiPen or a defibrillator hanging on the wall. But just as we wouldn't use a defibrillator on somebody and say, all right, you're good, go about your business. Right? They'd go into the hospital for a full battery of checkups. There might be treatment that follows, be any number of things that would follow that episode. I worry that with the volume of Narcan saves and, quite frankly, the busyness in some of the emergency rooms, that folks are being treated in a matter of hours in some cases, and they're brought in, and all of us who've never experienced a non-fatal overdose would look at that and say, boy, if that doesn't wake you up, what on God's earth will, right? You got a second shot at life, and don't you want to come out and say, I'm going to fix this? That's not usually the place that people come out to. It's just not.
They're angry that you ruined their high.
And when you suffer a non-fatal overdose, you increase exponentially your risk for a subsequent fatal overdose. And so I've done grand rounds at some hospitals to try to educate the nurses and physicians and social workers there about how to make treatment referrals, how to talk to families. I'll say that addicted patients aren't the favored sons when they wind up in emergency rooms. They tend to be difficult. There's a lot of things going on, not the most sympathetic. They're anxious to leave. In a lot of cases, the family's like, all right, I'm ready to go too. And so I know of cases where folks have been revived 3 and 4 and 5 times with Narcan. I know of cases where folks have been revived and subsequently died. And you can't point the finger. We should be in a place where Narcan is the least we can do, not the best we can do.
Exactly.
Right? If you want to really give somebody their life back, it's more than the breath they take in the next hour. It's how do you recreate that life? How do you create a life full of recovery? And that's a longer view kind of thing. It doesn't come in a $2 and $20 bottle of Narcan.
Right.
It comes in that bottle of Narcan, which gives you the opportunity to open up the treatment conversation, to walk somebody down that path of recovery, and then, God willing, celebrate a first, second, and 10th anniversary of sobriety.
Absolutely. Well, relapse is a part of the disease.
Yeah.
However, with that being said, recovery is so possible, and I know so many people now that are living full, vibrant,
Yeah.
productive lives.
Yeah. For a lot of people, relapse is a part of this. It doesn't have to be, and I always hesitate when I say that because it almost sounds like we're expecting that to happen.
Right.
So you want to say to somebody, look, if you relapse, there's a way to restart the clock, and it doesn't,
Absolutely.
and it's fine. Look, with most diseases, there's a possibility, and some diseases, there's a likelihood of relapse. It happens with every disease. This is no different. You get back in the saddle and you ride again. I think though, I think it's harder for young people now, and I think when we do prevention, those of us that do this professionally, we've made some mistakes, right? So even you and I, when we started talking about how bad it is and what the numbers are and how many are using and how many are going into treatment. How about the number of people that have found the path to recovery?
Yes.
Like, I do want to talk about the overdose numbers because they reflect some pain and they reflect a need and they get us feeling urgent and everything else. But how about if we balance the numbers and said, yeah, but this number of folks found the miracle of recovery. Treatment does work. And I put some of it on us because we want to paint the gloom and doom scenario to motivate people and say, look, you should care and here's why. But then we downplay those success stories, and I think we need to hear more of those.
We need to hear more and more success stories. And part of AA is to be anonymous.
Right.
So we both know, Tom Goris and Kate Meyer, who do
Right.
I Am Not Anonymous, and celebrate all these young people coming into recovery, and maybe not so young people. And young people in recovery, the club that just started with Courtney Lavelle, those are all things that need to be broadcasted to the world, because there is young people today think that when they're in recovery, what do you mean I'm never going to be able to drink again, smoke again, do anything again? And it's not okay if alcohol was never my drug of choice, so I'm okay if I drink. It's not okay, and the sooner that they figure that out, the better off they'll be. But to have a club where 20 to 30-year-olds can go and do activities where they're just enjoying life, because life is really good.
Right.
And you don't need a substance to enjoy it.
We haven't done a good enough job of making recovery cool. Kids want to do things that are cool.
Absolutely.
In some cases, we've hidden it away. Although I think every high school on Long Island should be a recovery high school, we don't have any recovery high schools.
No, we don't. That's a
And
problem.
very often you have young people that walk the road, that find a path to recovery. We dump them back into 12th grade, the classrooms that are filled with drugs and alcohol and everything else, and we say, all right, so why'd you get sick again?
Right.
Because you put me right back to the same place that
Same
I was.
place.
And so,
And they're not strong enough, and they're kids. We need to remember that. They're young adults.
In a lot of cases, they leave treatment. It's like stepping off a giant curb, and back into the abyss without a lot of support and without other people to connect to. And so, for me, this is an opportunity to change a culture. Like, for the first time in probably hundreds of years, you've got this entire cadre of young people that found the path to recovery really early on and have the ability to make recovery really, really cool. And say to other young people, look, me going into classrooms and saying, don't use drugs and alcohol, it's not going to resonate.
No.
But somebody like Tom or Courtney or someone who's a lot cooler than I am, quite frankly, it was able to go in and say, look, I did it all, I saw it all, I did all the same things you're doing. It might work out better for you, but here's how it worked out for me, and here's what I missed out on in the process. And yes, the life I have today is a gift. But it was a rough road to get here, and you needn't walk that road.
Exactly, and that, if it helps one person by doing that, so we do need to talk about awareness now, or prevention. And I know a lot of parents have a problem with the word prevention. They like awareness better. Yeah. So we'll call it awareness. But if we're going to not be having this conversation 5 years from today, we need to start to change 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders' view of the world and how they cope with it. Yeah. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and you know what? I think there's a difference. So awareness for me is the PSAs you see on television, those kinds of things. The prevention for me really is a more interactive, small group conversation with young people to talk about, if you're feeling pressured to use drugs or alcohol, how come? What's going on? Let's role play that a little bit. So when somebody offers you your first drink, what are you going to say? For me, prevention is helping folks to develop, young people very early on, to develop really solid refusal skills, communication skills, building the communication pathways with your teachers, with your coaches, whoever you might want to do. Doesn't guarantee that nothing is ever going to happen.
Absolutely.
But the more, it's almost like scaffolding. The more you can set up that scaffolding to deal with whatever comes our way, whether it's bullying, date rape, drug and alcohol use, depression, the more scaffolding you can set up, the more inoculated they are from all of that.
Absolutely.
And so, well, folks will say, well, there's no way to prevent this 100%. That's probably true, but are there ways that we can minimize the risk? Still means that something can go wrong.
Protective factors.
Look, I have seatbelts in my car and airbags and everything else. It doesn't mean I won't get into an accident. It doesn't mean that I won't be hurt. But I'm going to take some steps to try to minimize the injuries if it happen. I'm going to try to avoid it at all costs, but I'm going to do some things to protect myself.
Kids having a code that they can, if they're in a place,
right,
texting their mom and dad and just, whatever that word is, come and pick me up because I got to get out of here, is an important
right.
contract to have with your young adult.
Absolutely. And I worry that our schools now are so focused on specific subjects and specific tests, and I worry about, so kids these days, the socialization is a lot different. It's all done 42 characters on a phone. You'll notice probably the interactions, if you thought they were awkward 10 years ago among teenagers,
Yeah.
look at them now. And so they've lost some of those communication skills. The relationships have changed. They're not as connected to coaches. They're not as connected to teachers. In some cases, they're not
socially
as connected.
awkward.
Yeah, and so does that increase the risk? Yeah, I'd say, look, there's a whole bunch of things that increase or perhaps lower your risk for this. Again, there are no guarantees. So you want to do whatever you can to lessen those risks, and it's never foolproof. Look, there are parents who, I've spent a lot of time with, and I can look at and say, you did everything by the book, without a doubt. This is a biological phenomenon, and if you're the 1 in 10, it's something that you're going to struggle with, and it's just odds are, you're going to do okay or you're not going to do okay, and parents have something to do with it, but not everything to do with it.
Not everything to do with
Right.
it. You don't know if they don't have that switch.
Right.
You and I could have a drink and be fine.
Right.
And one person will have that, and they're going to stop at 7-Eleven on the way home and get a 12-pack, and
Absolutely.
they're going to keep the party going.
Right.
So does that make you and I better than them? No. Just
Right.
makes us lucky.
We'll wind up with different diseases. Right? So if
Yeah.
we view it as a brain disease and you look at the odds, look, there's a good chance that a fair number of folks walking around, particularly these days given the social pressures, will wind up developing an illness out of this. And you can do everything right, whatever that is, however that's defined, and still wind up with a problem. The key is trying to lessen those risks. And for parents, if you see something's going on, do your best to intervene early. Again, it doesn't guarantee that there won't be a problem, but it's about changing the odds.
We have to change the odds. We have to do a better job. It used to be, let's put them in sports. That's going to save everything. And parents need to understand that's probably where they're going to have their first drink.
Yeah,
Is at a
and look,
football
early
party.
onset alcohol use, and look, parents tend to focus on alcohol these days, but tobacco use is a big thing. Even now, energy drinks.
Oh.
And most parents will look at energy drinks and say, it's caffeine. Who doesn't drink coffee? It's true, but keep in mind that when kids are using 5-hour energy drinks at a very high level, they are for the first time altering their brain chemistry. So they've learned, when I alter my brain chemistry, I feel really good. If you used 1 5-hour energy drink this week, perhaps next week you use a little bit more, or you use a Mountain Dew to go along with it, and you get into the groove of managing and manipulating your brain chemistry so that your brain no longer does it on its own, and you begin to see that ratcheting up for some people. Again, if you have that switch in there, the Mountain Dew, the energy drinks are going to light up that switch differently than they would for somebody else.
Yeah. We only have a couple of minutes left, Jeff. Do you have any closing statements that, I want to offer hope?
Yeah.
So I would say to parents who are struggling with a child or with a loved one, because there are a lot of kids that I've spoken to, and the kids say, my mom, my dad, my grandma, and that's heartbreaking because they're living through the disease of addiction as a youngster. Yeah. So, where do they look for help?
You know, there's help available in every community, and I know this goes everywhere, so I won't give specific referrals, but there's a lot of help in every community. Every community has drug treatment centers. Every community has family support groups. Reach out to somebody else. And here's the other thing. If you see somebody struggling, reach out to them. It's kind of akin to walking past a lake and seeing somebody drowning. Throw them a life preserver.
Absolutely.
And if the first time they knock it away, throw it again.
Yes.
That reaching out is so critical. So if you're struggling, reach out soon, reach out early. If you see somebody struggling, do something about it. They'll thank you later.
I want to thank you for joining us this evening. And anyone that is struggling, you can find Thomas's Hope on Facebook. You can private message me, and I will help you as best I can to put you in touch with any professional that you may need. And if you just need somebody to talk with, cry with, I'm here for that also. I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. This was Long Island in Crisis. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for all you do. That's awesome.
Another dark hotel room, musty people.